On February 4th of this year, I published what was supposed to be the first video in a series where I would basically take a bunch of albums and rank every single song on each album from worst to best. This was not a typical ranking compilation. All of these albums were ranked together rather than separately, and as a compromise, I said I was going to do a video where I would review each album and then have a final ranking of each album at the end. Compromise being for the fact that I didn't have any reasonings in that video. Anyways, that was 9 months ago. So, in October, I finally put my foot down and made my decision. I was going to finish that video and probably not continue the series so I could focus fully on the worst best videos. Little did I know I had much more to say about these albums than I initially anticipated, to the point where that video, if I could have ever finished it, would probably have been at least a couple hours long. Not that I don't have any experience in making videos that are several hours long, but wasn't exactly a positive experience, and I'd rather pace myself a little, thank you very much. But besides that, I've been wanting to get into reviews for a little while now, so I figured this would be a good excuse. The album I've decided to start with from that original video is A Place Where Mountains Hide, which is the first album from A Cloudy Sky, released on July 22nd, 2019. A Cloudy Sky, for those of you that don't know, and I'm assuming most of you do, but just in case, A Cloudy Sky is an up-and-coming producer who's known for his atmospheric and bombastic synth-pop style, which he basically grew himself out of SoundCloud obscurity with. His discography ranges pretty heavily in terms of tone and structure, especially following this album, but I've always gotten a very mellow and overcast vibe from his work, especially his albums so far, despite how uplifting his music tends to be. A Place Where Mountains Hide is interesting because the way this album is structured feels more reminiscent of a double EP instead of an album, where the first half of the project has a completely different vibe from the second half, well, for the most part. And I remember being a little disappointed when listening through this album for the first time and coming to that midway point with the track alignment. I was firmly in the camp that the first half of the album was far superior to the second half, as to me the second half mostly consisted of half-baked bass tracks with very little to keep my attention. And I think even to this day I would think higher of this project if it was split into two different EPs, but with that being said, I've also grown to appreciate those tracks and, by extension, this whole project far more than I initially did back then. The opening track, Tethered, is definitely a mood setter. The overall tone of this track, conveyed by the sound design, is one of vastness, and that's something that I've always been fond of in music. It just scratches a certain itch I have when it comes to being immersed in something, I guess. Tethered doesn't really have any downsides to it. It's a very solid track that does everything it should do, both in context of the album and in how the track was laid out in general. I mean, perhaps the second half of the climactic drop where the drums go into this halftime phase was a little unnecessary, but that feels a little nitpicky, so I'll just move on from here. Fall Off is the next track on the list, and it basically accomplishes everything that Tethered was able to do, while also managing to be a fun little synth-pop romp that, in and of itself, manages to be both heartfelt and carefree, which scores even more brownie points with me. I think most of you probably know this already, but I fucking love this track. It's easily my favorite song in the album, and also my favorite song A Cloudy Sky has ever made up until this point. The overall structure of this track, the way it goes into the first drop and introduces that chord progression and eventually the lead as well, and the way it ends with that 4-on-the-floor beat that just feels so satisfying, man, what can I say? I mean, it's not an overly complex track. It's probably one of the most simple tracks on the album, but on this album, it's easily the one that had the best execution in my opinion. Moving on, we have Riverside, which, unlike the first two tracks which are more bombastic and uplifting, Riverside is more calm and chilled out. It's a purely introspective track and has the same mellow feeling I alluded to earlier, but it manages to be the most unique track on this album in my opinion. I do like how, even with the rest of this album being as hard-hitting as it is, Riverside doesn't really feel out of place and has its own kind of impact. It's one of those songs that I can't help but have a certain amount of respect for. If you told me this was your favorite on the album, I wouldn't agree, but I could certainly see why. Up next, we have Enveloping, which is pretty much the conclusion of the first melodic half of this album. It's an interlude, and it stretches on for about 3 minutes, but it doesn't feel long-winded, and I actually quite enjoy listening to it every now and again. The way the strings rise in the second half of the song always manages to send chills down my spine, and the soft finish it has at the end with the bouncing pluck is also something I really like for some reason. So now we've reached alignment, where the second half of this album begins, and things quickly transition from a focus on melody and atmosphere to a focus on more bass and impact, although I'd say alignment is a pretty decent compromise between both artistic visions of this album. Containing the former during the midsection and the second build at least, as well as having two bassy, impactful drops to build to in the first place. To be honest, I was never crazy about alignment. I think it's a good track that's catchy enough, but it doesn't really quite have the same appeal to me that the first 4 tracks do. And this kind of continues on with Nosedive, which I actually do like a bit more than alignment, but it has even less melody aside from some atmospheric fills in the background. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think this album was at its peak when it was more melodic and uplifting. I still appreciate that Skye managed to keep things unique and memorable throughout the second half of this album, giving Alignment a tribal-sounding theme, whereas Nosedive is more, I guess, generic-sounding in terms of what his bass music typically sounds like. Again, not a bad thing, and this isn't really a bad song, but I have a hard time stacking it up with some of the others on this album. One thing that does particularly bother me about this track, though, is the fact that the intro of this track was pretty much copy-pasted into the midsection, which it doesn't bother me too much. I imagine, if anything, it probably bothers acloudyskye more than it bothers me, but I wanted to point it out, because that's like one of the only real tangible complaints I have about any of the tracks on this album, other than it just being not to my taste. That being said, Skull Eater is my least favorite track on this album, and honestly, it's really not that bad. The main reason I'm not too fond of it is just that I'm not a fan of the drum samples used during the first drop. I mean, the second drop is groovy as all hell, but I think the best groove on this album comes in with Unraveling, which is the next track. I would consider Unraveling to be the heaviest song in the bunch being the second half of this album. Although I know most of you will probably contest that Skull Eater is heavier. I won't lie, the first drop on Unraveling is probably my favorite bass drop on this album, and that second drop is something else entirely. If there's anything I come back to here, it's this track. And now we have just one more to go. A Drowning Cry is the final track on this album, which basically serves to tie the whole thing together. I should probably talk about one thing I've yet to mention so far, which is acloudyskye's vocals, seeing as how they serve an especially important purpose here. I didn't mention them in Tethered or Fall Off, as in those cases I thought they were good, but I didn't think they elevated either track in any meaningful way. But with that being said, here in this track, they absolutely do. A Drowning Cry is very similar to Tethered in structure, being the album's send-off rather than its mood setter, but it manages to improve greatly on its spiritual predecessor in my opinion. It hits harder, has better vocals, and is just a very good song overall. So, now that we're done with the track list, I don't have a whole lot of complaints overall. I mean, I don't have too many high praises for this album, but it's very solid regardless. I mean, it's got one of my favorite songs of all time, and it's not like there aren't other tracks on here that don't put up a fight for that status. A Drowning Cry, Tethered, and even Unraveling are all really fantastic songs. And the others are all at least decent, with Fall Off being my personal highlight on the album, but I still think the bassy tracks in the second half of this album lack that extra memorability that the tracks in the first half of the album have. And I think that's about all I can say on this album. Little rough around the edges, as Skye put it himself, but still quite good, and I think it is well worth your time. So, how exactly am I going to rate these albums? I've actually thought about this for a while because I've experimented with different scoring systems in the past, and I feel like I've come up with one that, I would say is pretty good. So the way this works is that I'm going to rate the album on a scale from -5 to 20. Now, that might sound a little weird, but hear me out. First of all, I can't use decimals in this rating system, I have to use whole numbers. So, I'm not trying to overcomplicate things by going from 0 to 20. It's basically like going from 0 to 10, but I can only use whole numbers and 0.5s. Here I just want to use whole numbers, so it's from 0 to 20 instead. And second, if you're wondering why I'm going into the negatives instead of stopping at 0, that's because negative scores are for albums that have something objectively wrong with them. So, 0 means that there's nothing wrong with the album on an objective level, but I can't get any enjoyment out of listening to it. And 20 means that it's practically flawless, and I have to rate these using whole numbers only. So, with that out of the way, I'm giving A Place Where Mountains Hide a score of 15. So that's like a 7.5 out of 10, but keep in mind that my cutoff for generally enjoying or thinking positively of an album is like a 7, and that's in my scoring system, which would translate to a 3.5 out of 10, so all that to say, 15 is not bad. Anyways, that brings this review to a close, so I hope you enjoyed it, because I have several more albums to get through, and I will see you all in each and every one. I hope. Alright, see ya.